Hi Hires, we are in the Sustainability and Interdependence unit, the last key area, threats to biodiversity. If we remember the hippo, or if we don't, here's a way that we use this. It's a way of remembering the main factors that scientists think affect biodiversity. Depressingly, it's all about us. Okay, so any habitat change. Now, that used to say habitat destruction, but now there's a recognition that climate change, any impact from that, is also habitat impact that can affect whether things can live places. Invasive species. We'll look at a little bit more detail about how exactly we define invasive, and we are involved in that. Pollution. Population growth in terms of humans, and the demands that that therefore puts on the environment. And over-harvesting. Now, all of these, you could argue, they actually all start with the second P, with human population, but we'll move on. Okay, so a little bit more detail on the H, habitat change. So starting with the kind of most blatant. Obviously, if you destroy where something lives, then you cut down population numbers. If you keep doing it everywhere where they live, then you can end up with a full extinction. What you can do is have a localized extinction in the area where you've destroyed the habitat. It's not just about habitat destruction. One of the things we now realise is happening is habitat fragmentation. And what that means is that you start isolating populations, and fragmenting up a population is really important in terms of how stable that then leaves that population. You are more likely to lose alleles if you do this, and this is not good. If you have an animal that requires a wide range, if it's got a large territory that it needs to move just to get the resources it requires, then that could actually directly cause extinction as well. But this fragmentation is also called islandization, because what you're doing is creating islands of access for them. The picture here is showing the yellow is the tiger's historic range and the red is the current. So island biogeography is an entire branch of science, and it is looking at the study of species composition and species richness on islands. What is important to recognise is an island does not need to be in the middle of the sea. This here is an island of trees. There is a gap between it and all the other trees, and if that gap is too great to cross for a particular species, then that species is now on an island. It cannot actually do anything in terms of communication of genetics from one side to the other. So not in an ocean, but is an island. And what's important is that we've started to recognise that size of island can be really important, and a whole pile of other factors can really influence how likely you are to lose species. So don't worry too much about these graphs, but what I would like to point out here is the equilibrium number that we have here. So this is the kind of number of species in an island where we get a kind of balance between immigration and extinction. Okay, but if we have small islands or large islands, on a small island that balance point is much lower down than on a large island. So it is important how big the island is. What's now recognised is exactly how important the fragmentation has become for species. So if you imagine that we have our initial habitat here, and this is the original island, as it were. Okay, so here's our habitat, and what you have is some species which are really only coping with being inside. These are interior habitat species. But on the outside we have ones which are happy enough to be on the edge. If we cut this in two, so if we break this and fragment this section up, then this section in the middle here, this can no longer be interior. This is now edge. So the interior becomes a much smaller area on either side of this, and we actually end up with more edge comparison to interior. And that's why the size of the island can be absolutely essential if you're looking at these. So to try and deal with that, what we have is this idea of giving a habitat corridor. So that means something that is going to be wide enough for organisms to move between. So what we have is an area down here, we've got another area here, and then we've got the corridor that they can move through. But if you think about the edge issues, the edge to interior, then although if we have a look over here, so this looks like a pretty big green space, an attempt to give corridor. But if you have interior species, this looks very like edge. So what you would actually need is to have a much wider section over here, all the way to this side probably, and then we could have the edgy bits would be okay to here, and then you would have an interior section which could grow right the way across, and that would allow actual migration. But as this stands, it's questionable about whether it's actually a full habitat corridor or not. I, on the hippo, invasive species. So what do we mean by invasive species? So I'm assuming we've heard of the grey squirrel as an invasive species. You may have heard of the Chinese mitten crab. What we mean is it's non-native and it is now spreading and causing damage. There are huge numbers of invasive species that we try and track. There are some which are incredibly damaging to the environment. This is a diagram of the 5 key invasive aquatic plants that are an issue in the UK. And generally they become an issue because people have had them in their own ponds and gardens, and then they've kind of allowed them to get out. So native, to be absolutely clear, it's existed in that particular region as a result of normal natural processes. They moved in, that was it. Introduced means that they've been moved by humans. Naturalised means that they've established themselves in the new location, and invasive means that they are starting to damage the native species. That's normally by outcompeting through resources, but it could be for other reasons, like bringing in pathogens and direct predation, things like that. So why naturalised species become invasive very often is because that we've removed them from their normal natural state of limiting. So they're away from their natural predators, quite often away from natural pathogens, their parasites, and the competition that would normally hold their population in check. Everything is about balance, and this is not balanced. And what you've got now is a completely different relationship with all the new competitors that it now has. And if its tolerant curve is favouring the invasive over the native, then it will take over. This I thought was a very good graphic trying to show what actually happens with this. I also think it could be used for an awful lot of things, including things like coronavirus. Okay, so you start off with prevention, and that's trying to prevent a particular species getting into that particular environment. So that would make sense. Species absent, okay. It gets introduced. You get small numbers, localized populations, and you try and eradicate. So you try and completely remove it. And if you manage it, then good. You're back down to species absent, so just prevention. If it then moves into an rapid increase and you're starting to really struggle with it, you're no longer likely to be able to eradicate it. It becomes containment. So you try and just prevent it moving any further. If it is widespread and abundant, then it's all about trying to prevent it from doing as much damage as you can. So it's all to do suppressing the population and looking after the resources. Looking at our P's. Pollution. So pollutants just obviously can affect everything. Could be a land pollutant, an air pollutant, freshwater or seawater. Okay. So this is a simple version of the carbon cycle. And the carbon cycle is impacted very greatly by the pollution of increased carbon dioxide. Basically more carbon dioxide than can be removed by the natural impact of photosynthesis. We can think of the carbon cycle in lots of different ways in terms of producing it, but bottom line is this. Here is what we can do to produce carbon dioxide to put it into the atmosphere. Any respiration by any living thing is going to be producing carbon dioxide. Combustion of anything that is organic and contains carbon will also move carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Processes that move carbon dioxide out, we have photosynthesis. So there are places in the carbon cycle where we're holding carbon. These are called reservoirs. So there is the carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere, dissolved in the oceans, in the rocks, in the Earth's crust. We obviously have carbon inside every living thing because we're all carbon-based life forms. And you have areas where you've got very little decomposition so you can form coal eventually, or oil. If you want to keep cycles going, then you have to consider that there are tolerances within them. You can push them a little bit, but if you push them too far, then you could break it, basically. And that's what's often referred to as tipping points. So you look at points in the cycle that are impacted by human activities and you say, is that going to push that cycle too far? Is it going to be able to deal with it, or is it not? And there is a real problem because we don't understand how everything works at all. It's obviously huge amounts of research because we are aware now of how much of an impact this is having. Carbon cycle, that we just had a quick look at, is linked to greenhouse effect, and that's therefore linked to climate change. Just a reminder on the greenhouse effect. So we actually require the greenhouse effect. It is absolutely essential to keep our planet in the right place. It's referred to as quite often the Goldilocks zone, not too hot, not too cold, but the greenhouse effect is actually necessary for us to be the not too hot and the not too cold, which is basically linked to keeping water liquid. Without having our natural greenhouse effect, it would be too cold. But what we're creating is the enhanced greenhouse effect, and that means that we've got more greenhouse gases than we actually want in the upper atmosphere. So our radiated heat that is not getting back out into space is causing global warming, and then over time that is having an impact on our climate, hence climate change. It's really important that we get the right terms being used in the right places. Not that we shouldn't be looking at everything else, but just to put this in human terms, the following is based on 3 things that were looked at in a particular study to figure out exactly how much of an impact climate is having on, and climate change is having on, potentially human populations. They looked at 3 things. So they looked at how likely climate related issues would be to impact, so like how low lying you are and how much of a sea level rise would cause a problem. Human sensitivity, so that's in terms of the natural resource being used, how much is dependent on particular agriculture, conflicts, natural population patterns that are currently in that particular area, and then looked at how well could you actually survive it purely because you have good infrastructure and a government that could actually cope with it. And this is what they came up with. This is quite drastic. What we have is areas that are saying low risk to extreme risk, and you'll notice that we're not in the totally low risk, and you'll see that it's more extreme risk down in the south of England, and that's mainly because of population pressure. Because the denser the population is, obviously the more impact you have. And you also have some areas down there where you would say that the particular places, like so for example London, any increase in sea level is going to have an impact on that because of how much population is based around the Thames. So you can look at all sorts of things about how this impacts, but some of them are quite worrying. More people live in the red region than in the entirety of all the grey combined. Next P. Okay, one of the impacts on human population is on extinctions. Our best data sets are for big enough animals that we can count them, basically. So here we have bird extinctions and mammal extinctions, and then we have the human population curve. Now you could argue that correlation, in this case we can definitely see that it is of a similar, the lines go together. Correlation does not mean causation, but there is a lot of evidence for this, that it is our population growth which is directly linking to the extinctions of others. Probably because you then look at our population and then we look at habitat change and all the other things that are then impacting. Generally, what we would say is that populations tend to hit a point where if they go too high, like in this one here, the population gets a little bit too high and then it gets brought back down by other things, other systems, whether it's predators, disease. Population now is lower, so it goes back up again, and you end up with this up and down and up and down and up and down. And you had this with the predator-prey links in that 5. What you have if you zoom out is a line, basically a straight line that says this is what we can actually sustain, and this is what we mean by the carrying capacity. It is the maximum that a particular ecosystem can sustain for that species. There is a lot of argument now about what the carrying capacity of the planet is for humans. So overharvesting obviously could just knock out a species, just make it go extinct because you've just dropped down the number of individuals. But it also has a real impact in terms of the genetic diversity which you have. So naturally, you will get frequencies of alleles that will just drift up and down. You could go extinct in a particular population, or it could become fixed in a particular population, and that's normal, that's natural, it's part of evolution and speciation. Okay, alleles will change. Problem is that the smaller the population, the quicker you lose your alleles. So the lower the variation in a species, the less robust that species is to change. Don't worry too much about this graph. I just want you to get the idea that the bigger the population in terms of variation, so this would be the high levels up here, the longer that population remains genetically variable. If we have a low variation, so let's take this line down here, then we start off with 50% of the variability remaining, and very quickly after over generations we lose that variation, and that's just not good for a species. What you can create if you produce a very small number in the population by whatever way you have, i.e. overharvesting, then what you've done is produce a small number of the population that is passing on its genetics, and if that's the only ones that are passing on, you can lose all of the alleles that were available from the population originally. So before we came along, this could happen, perfectly reasonable it could happen. It would be a natural event, drastic, that wiped out a big chunk of the population and only left a small number there. Okay, but then their genetics would then carry forward. We've done several, okay, generally through overharvesting, but also habitat destruction. Elephant seals are a really good example of this. They were hunted down to 20 individuals at the end of the 19th century. We are now up to 30,000, but what that means is that the DNA that's in those 30,000, all of the diversity in there, except for any new mutations which have occurred since, was what was in the 20 original that we forced it down to. And then what we've then got potentially is inbreeding. There is something also called the founder effect, which go and have a look up if you want to. It's quite interesting. It's exactly the same impact, but this one is due to actually moving a small number of individuals into a particular area. So the more severe that bottleneck, the more likely you are to lose alleles. You lose the rarest first. This would be a graph which tries to show you, again, don't worry about it too much in terms of the absolute information on it. What you're looking for though is, here is your frequency of the allele. So 0.01 would be a very low frequency, and we've got 0.5 at a very high frequency. If this is your population size going along the bottom here, if you have a low frequency allele, so you're blue, then you can see it's doing fine. This is the probability of losing an allele is 0 when it's up at a reasonably high population. Even at 200, it's starting to say, well, there's a possibility of losing it, probability of losing it rather, and then this is increasing drastically the smaller your population gets. If you have a high probability of keeping an allele, however, if you have a high frequency of it. Okay. Overall, just want you to continually think that the ecosystems that we have all around us provide us with so many things. There is the obvious, in terms of it provides us with provisions, things that we need, like water and raw materials and food. There are things which are to do with our ecosystem that are regulating everything around about us. That's our water, our climate, everything like that. Things that maintain our ecosystem, and also things that for us are really important from a cultural point of view. I've had so many things telling you that it's important that you get outside and that you feel better if you've been outside for a bit. Our ecosystems are important round about us, and we should be trying to understand them before we do anything to damage them. And if we have damaged them, we should be trying our absolute best to recover them.